going to make a short introduction because he is one of our regular speakers and one of our members. But Aaron has been doing a lot of research on the church and is very active in it. And he always does a great job. He's doing St. John's Episcopal Church. And we look forward to hearing what you say about it.
All right. Thank you, Delly. Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It is very cold outside, and which is why I am all the more honored that any of you decided to come out on a cold evening to hear me talk about St. John's Episcopal Church. But I'm glad to be here, glad to see you all, and hopefully we can all warm up together for our time. I'm going to be talking to you tonight about St. John's Episcopal Church, 185 years of Anglican worship in Crawfordsville. I have been an Episcopalian since 2013, when I moved back to Crawfordsville in fall of 2021. I started attending St. John's Episcopal Church, but it's funny how that church, even when I was a kid, was kind of in the backdrop of my life. Probably my earliest memory there was taking Spanish classes with Diane Combs at Whitlock Hall in the 90s. So that's my earliest memory of being there. But it's been fun since coming back to Crawfordsville as an adult to participate in the life of the church and to learn more about its very, very long and lengthy history. So I'm going to not touch on every aspect of its history, but I'm going to be highlighting just the chronology, some key figures, and some things that I think you all might find fascinating about it. And so the session overview for tonight, we're going to talk about in the beginning, so the earliest days of St. John's and how it came to be from 1835 to 1837. Ambrose Whitlock holds St. John's together from 1838 to 1866. A period of time that I'm just going to call hanging on from 1874 to 1956. Stability and expansion from 1957 to 1960. St. John's and community from 1960 to 1986. And then at the very end, I'll just talk briefly about St. John's today. Before I get started, I really want to give credit to Fern Brill, who maybe some of you in this room may have known Fern. Everything that I'm talking about tonight is really coming from this book. And so, if anything, I am just reinterpreting and repeating the wonderful research that Fern did way back in the 1980s, which I assume she did in part for St. John's to get its status on the historical register. So her work was key in making that happen for St. John's, and so Fern, I honor you tonight. So with that, starting in the beginning with Father Melanchthon Hoyt. So Father Melanchthon Hoyt was the first parish minister of St. John's. He was born in Connecticut in 1809. He was a Yale graduate, and he arrived in Crawfordsville in 1835 after initially being appointed missionary to Indianapolis. And at the time, Crawfordsville was actually a bigger town than Indianapolis, if you can believe it. And so he was initially in Indianapolis, but according to Fern's research, he came to Crawfordsville because he thought he could raise more money for a church and thus get paid more. So, which, I mean, it makes sense to me why he wanted to come to Crawfordsville rather than Indianapolis for that reason. This last bit about Melanchthon Hoyt and Lou Wallace. This was brought to my attention by one of St. John's parishioners, Christopher Short. He told me that in one of Lou Wallace's biographies, when he talks about coming to Crawfordsville as a young boy and participating in some schooling related to Wabash College. Apparently, Lew Wallace had a very strict instructor that he did not like, but he mentioned that this instructor was an Episcopal priest, and so that happens to that time when Lew Wallace was first here in Crawfordsville as a boy happens to coincide with Melanchthon Hoyt's tenure here in Crawfordsville, and so while it's not confirmed, I'd be interested to confirm it. Perhaps Lew Wallace and Melanchthon Hoyt had a rather rough relationship, so I thought I would add that there. This picture is of him later in life. He did not have a beard when he was a priest here, but yeah, that gives you kind of an idea of what he looked like. The other key figure in St. John's getting started was Bishop Jackson Kemper. So Bishop Jackson Kemper was the first missionary bishop of the Episcopal Church, and so in 1835 he gets consecrated to be sent out to what was then still often called the Old Northwest Territory. Indiana was a state by this point, but it was still being called like the Old Northwest by many people. And so he gets sent out from Philadelphia to raise up the Episcopal Church. And so he arrives in Indiana in 1835, and he kind of makes a sweep along southern Indiana. So there's records of him being in New Albany, in Madison, Indiana, Evansville, and then he makes his way up to Crawfordsville because he hears about Melanchthon Hoyt already being present in the area doing additional missionary work. And so I want to mention briefly about the perception of Episcopalians in the Midwest at the time. And so Episcopalians didn't necessarily have the greatest reputation among settlers here in the area. Because Episcopalians kind of represented the elites or the aristocracy, people with means, and so if you're kind of a pioneer, not having a lot of money, you already kind of feel a little alienated from people with money. And so the other reason that Episcopalians didn't necessarily have the best reputation is because many of them allied with Great Britain during the American Revolutionary War, and so there was already a little bit of suspicion, like, oh, you're not as American as the rest of us because you wanted to stay with Great Britain. So that's another reason. And then the third reason was just simply because of Episcopal liturgy being so similar to Catholic liturgy. There's also that association, that kind of anti-Catholic sentiment, some of that downriver also applied to Episcopalians. So Jackson Kemper had a rough time, and Melanchthon Hoyt had a rough time convincing people in Indiana to consider the Episcopal Church. In his diary, Jackson Kemper talks about Indiana looking woody, interesting, and inviting at the time. He arrives in Crawfordsville on January 30th, 1836. He probably stayed at Henry Renstein's Tavern, which, if you're familiar with Crawfordsville history, Henry Renstein was one of the first settlers here in Crawfordsville. He had a tavern set up. It was one of the only places that a person could stay if you were new to the area. And at that time, Jackson Kemper probably also met with Ambrose Whitlock, who's the founder of Crawfordsville, and I'll talk more about Whitlock here in a little bit. But 1836, he arrives and just kind of gets to know some of the prominent people in Crawfordsville. The name of St. John's, so why it has the name St. John's Episcopal Church. Bishop Kemper, being a missionary bishop, so very cognizant of evangelism and being interested in evangelism. If you look at many of the Episcopal churches, especially the older ones here in Indiana, many of them are named either St. John's or St. Paul's. And so St. John's, named after St. John the Evangelist in the Bible, St. Paul the Apostle being a major missionary figure. So it makes sense that Jackson Kemper, as he's going around as a missionary person, he's going to name a church either St. John's or St. Paul. So that's essentially, maybe for the first one, he's like, I'll call this one St. John's, and I'll call the next one St. Paul. So that's essentially how it got the name. Why Crawfordsville? As I mentioned, Melanchthon Hoyt was already trying to form a mission in Crawfordsville at that time, and also Wabash College's presence was also attractive. So if you are trying to build a church, you need clergy, and if you've got someplace that is teaching young men and to be highly educated, and clergy are highly educated, makes sense if you're trying to get a church going. So, on March 28, 1836, Reverend Hoyt writes about a church has been organized and a building committee appointed, and about $1,300 pledged for the erection of a building. He was having some trouble fundraising, and so at one point he goes out east to fundraise, and so there's record of like $50 or $100 from various Episcopal parishes in like Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and all of this is crucial towards getting the building going up. John Garrison, a local of Crawfordsville and a vestryman, is selected as the local builder, and a Mr. Edwin Peck of Madison, Indiana, is selected as the architect. This is from the book. This was a drawing painted by Elizabeth Sharpless. And so this depicts the initial building of St. John's as it appeared from 1837 to 1872. So it is in the style of what's called Greek Revival. Other Episcopal church buildings you'll later see, they're either in what's called Romanesque or Gothic. But this one's unique even among Episcopal churches in Indiana in the sense that this Greek Revival is more evocative of like colonial era type buildings. So that's the style. Bishop Kemper laid the cornerstone on June 8th, 1837, and administered communion and confirmation on June 11th in the courthouse building because the building was not yet completed. There were 6 confirmands, including Ambrose Whitlock, Gustavus Scott, John Garrison, Marie Jones, Sarah Canby, and Elizabeth Ann Jones, who was Ambrose Whitlock's niece. The building itself was not dedicated until 1851 due to a lack of funding, and so Fern mentions in her book, in the history book, that sometimes meetings would take place at the courthouse, other times meetings would take place in the house, in other people's homes, but it's not clear necessarily how often St. John's met in the building itself, because it was it didn't go up overnight. It was a process between 1837 to 1850. So I find it interesting that the building itself is not dedicated until 1850. On the historical register, St. John's is mentioned as the first Episcopal church building in Indiana, not necessarily the first Episcopal congregation. So St. Paul's in Evansville and the Episcopal parish in New Albany, I can't remember its name, are technically slightly older congregations than St. John's, but the first building in the Episcopal Church was St. John's. And to give you an idea of where the location was, so it was at the corner of Market Street and Water Street. So I give you, here's the picture on the left, which shows where the building was, and then this is a Google Maps picture to kind of give you a rough idea. So where St. John's was, it's kind of roughly like behind where the t-shirt shop is now, kind of not too far away from the railroad tracks. So right there at Water and Market Street. And Ambrose Whitlock, I want to note, he donated the land for St. John's, and right next to St. John's was the land office. So when people were buying up land in Indiana, they would come to Crawfordsville, they'd come to the land office, they'd presumably talk to Ambrose Whitlock or get a deed signed off by Ambrose Whitlock, and so the church was right next to the land office there. Ambrose Whitlock holds St. John's together, 1838 to 1866. The first families of St. John's between 1837 to 1851 included Whitlock himself, Beale, Bailey, Benford, Lamborn, McGinnis, Scott, Riley, Snyder, Wynn, and Dunn. So those are the names that are included there. Father Hoyt resigned as priest on October the 31st, 1838, for unknown reasons. He moved out east first, and then later moved out to the Dakotas, and actually was very prominent in the early days of South Dakota. So he was a legislature in the first state government of South Dakota. So bye-bye Melanchthon Hoyt for his Crawfordsville time. And so the reason I mention, or I call this time Whitlock holds St. John's together, is because he's the most consistent leadership presence when there's this revolving door of ministers at St. John's. And so between 1838 to 1850, there's not much known about St. John's other than there wasn't really a permanent rector. There was just a rotating list of visiting priests. Bishop Kemper came out at least 2 more times, but most of the time people just met for morning prayer, and they didn't always necessarily meet consistently. But Ambrose Whitlock was the senior warden, so the most senior lay leader in the church from its start in 1837 to when he died in 1863. So, and my impression from Fern's book is like he was the primary benefactor. When meetings did happen, he was usually the one to coordinate and make it happen. So this picture of Ambrose Whitlock, coincidentally, this is from an engraving by Lew Wallace. So Lew Wallace made this image of Ambrose Whitlock. So, as I mentioned, the church seems to be disorganized from 1838 to 1850. The parish formally reorganized and met in the building on September 28th, 1850 for worship. And then the building is finally dedicated by Bishop Upfold in 1851. So, no rector from 1853 to 1859, continued rotating list of clergy and bishop. Father Doherty from 1860 to 1861, Father Charlotte, Father Samuel Edson, and then no rector from 1864 to 1866. So again, this is a parish that is barely hanging on, is what I'm trying to say. I want to note that during the Civil War period of the Episcopal Church in Indiana, was oversaw by this guy in this picture, Bishop Upfold. Bishop Upfold was alleged to be a Southern sympathizer and did not want his clergy preaching about slavery or abolition or about the war. And so I just find it very interesting that for the Episcopal Church in Indiana at the time, there was a sense of not wanting to get involved politically, so to speak. So Ambrose Whitlock dies in 1863. He had been the senior warden for 26 years at that point. And now we come to Father Isaac Hagar, who kind of inaugurates this next big chapter in St. John's history. So Father Isaac Hagar arrives in 1866, and he marks kind of the first term of stability at St. John's, really since Melanchthon Hoyt had left. And so by that, I mean, he was around for more than 2 years. So he had, before he came to Crawfordsville, he had done missionary service in Colorado and Nebraska, so he was crucial in helping Bishop Talbot at the time with establishing parishes out there, and then he came out to Indiana. The number of the congregation during this time increased from 22 to 67, and Fern notes in the vestry documents from this time that the bills were paid. So whereas before, the vestrymen have been like, oh, we're in debt, we can't pay for a rector, we can't pay for our building. The bills are paid in 1866, so the tone kind of changes. Father Isaac Hagar was apparently beloved by many people. He was noted for being a strict disciplinarian for expelling members due to misconduct, but he also conducted many burials for non-members of St. John's, especially among the black population. So Isaac Hagar is somebody I really want to do more research on. I'll tell you more about why here in a bit. But you get this sense that when his time in Crawfordsville, he left a mark, whatever that ended up being. And so Isaac Hagar dies suddenly on June 27, 1870 of consumption, which is tuberculosis. And he was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery, actually not too far from where Ambrose Whitlock is buried. So in his memory, there is a stained glass window that is funded by his brother. And so this all happened his death was very sudden and unexpected, and kind of inaugurated this very difficult time period at St. John's, where it's lost this beloved rector. Debts start to mount up, and they have to move the building from Market Street to its current location on Green Street. And so the stained glass window itself, it is by far our biggest window. It hangs up on the east transept of the church, above the altar. And Fern spends a whole big chapter in the history book just on trying to track down who made this window, what is it about. And so it depicts St. John the Evangelist. We know that, and so if you can't really see from here, but St. John's is holding like a gospel book to indicate his status as an evangelist, and he's also holding a cup with 2 snakes in it. So the legend goes that St. John's had been bitten by snakes, by poisonous snakes, but he did not die, and so that's what the snakes are. And he actually, so that's the reason why there's snakes in the cup. And then at the top, you'll see this symbol of like the 3 circles with a big circle in the middle. That's supposed to indicate the Trinity. So 3 in 1. of the Trinity there. So Fern, she's trying to track down who made this window. There was a rumor for a long time that this was a Tiffany window, which, if you're familiar with Tiffany, legendary glassmaker, Fern disproved that because, for one thing, this window was installed in 1837, and Tiffany did not incorporate as a company until 1875. So by virtue of timing, it wouldn't have been a Tiffany window. The best case scenario, or the most likely conclusion that Fern came to after talking with various researchers around the country, is that the window was likely made in England or Belgium and was imported to America. So, which is pretty impressive for the early 1870s, like that somebody paid for this, went through all the trouble to move it to little Crawfordsville in honor of this Isaac Hagar, which again, I want to know more about Isaac Hagar. Like, if somebody's going to spend that much money to get that fancy of a window to Crawfordsville, Indiana, this Isaac Hagar person must have been a decent fellow, so, or at least I'd like to think that. I mentioned that the church building moved in 1873, and the reason why it was moved was the railroad. So there's talk of smoke from the train billowing into the church during Sunday worship, and so, which I can imagine the noise was not that great either, and so with that, the decision was made to move the church from its location on Market Street to where it's at now on Green Street. And you'll notice 3 circles there on the picture. That circle in the middle was where the church building was stuck temporarily sometime between January and March of 1873. So there's a note in Fern's book about getting stuck in the mud, kind of around where the Tri-County Bank is today. They're on Main Street, and so they had to. I mean, they were moving this all by a big bunch of horses on a platform of sorts, and so they had to take the building off, put it there for a few weeks for the mud to harden up, and then they moved it the rest of the way to its current location. And so it was a big process for 1873. Hanging on from 1874 to 1956, and I'm gonna, for the sake of time, I'm gonna move quickly through this section. Father Sam Junt, 1874, resigned due to lack of funding from the parish. Father Lemon from 1876 to 1878, Harrington 78 to 80, Duncan Jowden from 82 to 84. Again, a period of revolving door of rectors, and the church cannot pay for its expenses. It cannot pay for its rectors, so thus they leave. In 1891. I thought it was interesting, this Father Glover, he arrives very optimistically at St. John's. He says, St. John's is in a bleak atmosphere, yet I hope to build a strong church here. And then he's only around for 6 months. So, in 1899, there were only 22 communicants. So if you think about during the high point of Isaac Hagar, there were 67. By 1899, it had gone down to 22. And things had gotten so bad that in 1901, at the diocesan convention, the bishop makes the declaration that St. John's is no longer a parish. It has reverted back to a mission. And so, like, the church it's receding and barely hanging on. I do want to note that this Samuel Smythe, he was the senior warden after Ambrose Whitlock. He was senior warden for 37 years from 1863 to 1900. So with all these revolving doors of priests coming and going, he's the only consistent leader there. So thank you, Samuel Smythe, for keeping the church doors open. I want to mention that during this time, in addition to the window, the baptismal font was included. The baptismal font, it was fundraised by Elizabeth Benford, who was the daughter of Ambrose Whitlock's niece. And it was designed and built by Sidney Speed, son of John Speed. So for context, Sidney Speed was a stonemason, architect, Civil War veteran, and I'm a big fan of his work because I see his work all the time in the cemeteries. Many of the gravestones in Montgomery County were designed by Sidney Speed, and he also did this baptismal font. And his father was the second mayor of Crawfordsville and an abolitionist and a cool dude in general. So I really appreciate that baptismal font for its connection to the Speeds.
And Speed Cabinet Lane Place.
That's right, Speed Cabinet Lane Place. So yeah, it was installed in 1883. Hanging on, this picture is what the church looked like from 1918 to 1950. So you can see there was a tower in front for a time there, and it's got moss growing over it. No vestry minutes from 1922 to 1955. So there are some scattered records of marriages, baptisms, and burials, but no vestry minutes, which again tells you like it was barely surviving as a parish. It got to the point where in 1951, Vicar Connor reports that oftentimes he arrived for services, but no one else did. During this time, however, I want to make mention that Professor Hans Frey very briefly was a deacon at St. John's in 1953 while also being a professor at Wabash College. Hans Frey is a huge name in the field of theology. When I was at Princeton Seminary, I read his work extensively there. So he became famous later in life for being a big deal at Yale Divinity School and being kind of one of the fathers of what's called narrative theology. So there's a picture of Hans Frey there, and I like to note his St. John's connection. 1957 to 1960, stability and expansion. So the Reverend Donald Foster, he stays for more than 2 years as a priest. So at this time, Reverend Donald Foster, he was from England and served in the Navy in World War II. It was around when he arrived that the vestry petitions the diocese for reinstatement to parish status by intention to support a rector without missionary aid. So finally, by 1957, St. John's is viable again and can support a priest and pay its debts. So again, I'm skipping ahead on time, but I wanted to mention Reverend Tanya Beck Vonnegut. So Tanya Vonnegut was the second woman to be regularly ordained in the Episcopal Church, and she was ordained at St. John's on January 8th, 1977 by Bishop John McGool Croom. Fern notes that there was resistance to Tanya Vonnegut being ordained, and there was actually threats that were sent to the church and to Tanya Vonnegut and her family to the point where there had to be 2 plainclothes police officers in attendance at St. John's when that happened. But it was a big deal. Female clergy person being ordained in Crawfordsville. 1960 to 1985, St. John's and Community. And here I'm just noting the many, many organizations that St. John's members have been involved with, especially League of Women Voters, Youth Service Bureau, and Montgomery County Free Clinic. So all of these organizations have had ties to St. John's members over the years. And I also want to mention St. John's of Wabash College. So there's been many different religion professors who have preached at St. John's, especially in the absence of clergy. The music department has provided instrumentalists for major Holy Week events, Christmas events. President Seymour was at one point a St. John's attendee for a time. And of course, there's been many Wabash professors and staff and alumni that have all been connected to St. John's. And I also want to note too, Pioneer Chapel, when St. John's has had to do renovations, Pioneer Chapel at Wabash has been a place where St. John's would meet. So really, really tight connection with Wabash College. In the 1960s, St. John's had some involvement with the Equal Rights Movement. Father Roy Turner was a supporter. There were meetings of the local NAACP and the Human Rights Council that took place in the Undercroft. Letters from the parish were sent to all 100 senators to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then there was a local protest here in Crawfordsville when Governor George Wallace visited and spoke at Liberty Baptist Church. And so these pictures are actually from that protest. I found this in a Wabash College alumni magazine. So I just find that interesting that St. John's was involved with that in the 60s. And then just to tie things up, so talking about St. John's today, we average about 40 to 50 on a given Sunday. We brought in Father Jason Fortner last fall, so we're enjoying having him with us. We continue to have partnerships with Volunteers for Mental Health and Indiana Youth Group, as well as First Christian Church.
You're loud enough, why don't we just turn that on?
Sure. We have adult education on Sundays, and then our education for ministry group also meets. So yeah, feel free to come visit us on any given Sunday. Our services are 8 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. That's in Street St. John's.
Partnership with First Christian.
So we often partner on educational events. So whenever we have like a special topic or series that we want to do together, we've had various lay leaders and clergy share and leading those series. So yeah, any questions?
First, about how large is the current congregation?
40 to 50 average Sunday attendance, give or take. So.
And second, do you happen to have any understanding of the origin of the word Melanchthon? That
I do
name
not.
I've never heard of. It seems very interesting.
Yeah. I'm assuming English in origin. Melanchthon point. So.
Ms. Vonnegut, have any connection to her Vonnegut?
Not that I'm aware of, although it would make sense if there was a Vonnegut connection. So, yeah.
My wife informs me that in her readings she's come across there was a theologian by the last name Melanchthon.
Could be Philip Melanchthon, I'm not sure.
Yeah, Philip Melanchthon, it's a Lutheran theologian, yeah.
15 or 1600s, she thinks.
Oh, okay. Very good. Very good. Well, thank you all for letting me speak with you all today.
Where's the archives for Episcopal?
So the archives, many of them are here in your library itself. I know the vestry minutes up to, I want to say the 50s have been turned over here to the library.
Plus,
and then all the rest are still in the St. John's office. So.
plus we do have the images for baptismal, marriage, and some of the early ones online on our library website under
Excellent.
digitized resources.
Wonderful. Yes, Shannon.
NAACP, is that in Fern's book?
The only thing, she mentions that they met in the Undercroft at St. John's, but that's about it.
But that's because I've got the book, I actually had to cheat and go to Amazon by orders to see if I had it, so I'm gonna go back and dig, and it's a place to start.
There you go.
Because that's our next project.